And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this Volume 6 of the Integralist Chronicles. So tonight I want to start in 1997. By that point, I had gone full-blown into politics. The political curiosity in my life had started to build from when I started in the really 93, 94, studying Catholic apologetics, and then being concerned with many issues, starting with the pro-life issue. It naturally led to an interest in politics, particularly in this American left and right dichotomy, this big debate. And by 96, 97, I'm starting to get really curious about politics. And I met a friend of mine when I was working at a grocery store, and we started talking lots of politics together. And that's when I started to lean in toward the classical liberal conservative movement. That's when I started listening to guys like Rush. I think it wasn't long after that Fox News came on the air, I think right around 96 with Hannity and Combs. I started reading guys like, let's see here, who was there? There was a bunch of guys at the time. Thomas Sowell was a big one for me. Guys like Larry Elder, who's on the West Coast, Dennis Prager, Michael Medved, all these conservatives. I mean, I was in the matrix, the conservative matrix, and I was entering at that time. And it was an exciting time in many ways because I thought I found something really important and meaningful in life. And as I studied and learned politics, I became very ambitious, very excited about entering because I thought that I guess politics was the answer to the problems of society. I was going to get into politics. I was going to change hearts and minds like El Rushbo used to teach. And we're going to take back America by changing hearts and minds. Little did I know what I know now. You know, it's amazing what age does for you, experience, and things like that. But you know, that's where I was at the time, and I had become sick of working at the grocery store. You know, I wanted to move on to something bigger and better in my life, especially as my intellectual curiosity was kind of, you know, coming to a peak in many ways, and I wanted to learn more and study more. And I decided to go back to college. You know, it was interesting for me, my college experience, especially because it wasn't my first time. The first several times I tried college, you know, I kind of went because that's what you're supposed to do in America, right? Teachers tell you got to go to college. If you don't go to college, you get an education, you're basically going to fall behind and not live a good life, kind of a thing, right? Well, when I was younger, I didn't have that intellectual curiosity. I struggled all through grammar school and high school and things like that. And I tried going to college in LA, and it didn't work out for me. But this time around, I was older, much more mature, and that intellectual curiosity was driving me now, particularly in the area of politics and history. And so here I entered into a junior college, and boy, was it interesting. Granted, maybe not as, how should I say this? Maybe not as serious or as, you know, as deep in leftist ideology as entering a four-year university, which I would eventually go to. But it was interesting being a conservative, or at least somebody with not just conservative values, but Catholic religious values at a university. And boy, the professors are clearly 99% liberal. I think the only thing closest that ever came to a professor that was not a liberal was a libertarian professor I had in the political science course that I took. And I found myself as a young conservative, learning, young, ambitious, that I was fighting everybody in that class, 1 on 20, 1 on 30, because, you know, most of these kids were either ideologically indoctrinated in high school when they were very young and impressionable, and all the social issues had consumed everybody, right? Like I said in the last cast, this is the 90s. Morality has just absolutely collapsed by the 90s. And so anybody in their teens and early 20s is gravitating toward anything that's socially liberal, right? Which puts everybody in that far left camp. And here I am, I'm a little bit older, I'm a little bit more religious minded, and I find myself in enemy territory, let's put it that way. and Marxism was being taught clearly there. I think I had in junior college, well, let me see, between junior college and eventually a four-year university, I was given the Communist Manifesto to read at least 3 times. Never once was I ever required to read something like The Wealth of Nations, right? Now, I'm not the biggest fan of The Wealth of Nations and things like that, but the point is that would be the counter argument for conservatives. But we were sure as heck made sure we read the Communist Manifestos as often as we could. And it was an interesting experience. And I remember one specific teacher. I'll never forget this one. It was an English class, and we were studying various issues. It might have been English literature, that kind of a thing. And I remember her, what was it? We had a book, or she passed out a piece of paper where it showed that famous picture of Norman Rockwell, where you got the family all around the turkey dinner on Thanksgiving. And of course, it was the all-white family around the turkey dinner, kind of a thing. And that was a moment for the English teacher to preach to all of us how this was not representative of America, how this was basically a white America of many years ago, and now that America is kind of much different now, right? We're much more diverse. This picture no longer represents America, and suggesting that it was somewhat racist, right? And so, to me, I'm like, okay, I don't see how this is really relevant, considering, cultures are what they are at any given time. But then the conversation was brought up, and that is, she started talking about the malformed family in sort of liberal society now, because now the breakdown of the family was happening at a rapid pace. And the question that was proposed one day in class was, well, to us by the professor to the class was, well, does your family look like kind of, the Cleavers, from Leave It to Beaver, where you got the homely mom and the very, chivalrous dad, and you got all this great white family that's well ordered, and they're very respectful and polite, and they're well put nuclear family right together, and they're very wholesome, right? And that was a question, right? Is your family more like the Leave It to Beaver family, or is it more like some of these other alternative families that we see now? And again, what was sweeping television in the 90s? It was Friends, right? The shacking up out of wedlock. It was the Murphy Brown and having kids out of wedlock. It was, what's that one? Dharma and Greg, or all those, right? Where we begin to show now alternative lifestyles and different setups, right? Especially with the shacking up out of wedlock and having kids when you're not married now, purposely having kids when you're not married now, sort of symbolizing now this new American family, that it's not wholesome anymore, it's not nuclear anymore, and the definition of family now has broadened in modern liberal times. And in many respects, I get what she was saying, and I think she was right. But from my perspective, and I was the only one in the class, of course, I said, well, my family's more like Leave It to Beaver. And everybody just kind of looked at me. It was kind of a weird moment. I said, I don't recognize any of these alternative families that you guys are talking about here. I mean, this may be on TV, this may be here, this may be there. There may be lots of people living in what I call sin, and I said that in the classroom. But quite frankly, my family's never been through a divorce. I've never had a broken family. I've never had, we've never had infidelity in the family. There's never been illegitimacy in the family. There's never been any of these disorders. Because again, I'll go back to the Catholic family. Catholic families are together. They're strong, not only nuclearly, but even extended families stays together for the most part, at least until the global economy kicks in, right? Which started kicking in right about that time in the 90s as well, too, the global economy, which helped facilitate the destruction of the family. But for my part, if you're telling me that we got all these moral social dysfunctions, I'll go back to what I said in the last cast. Them is some Protestant problems. They are. And my wife, who's half Jewish, would suggest that, well, even Jews partook of the destruction of the family in that sense as well, too. Now, was there Catholics starting to have problems at that time? Yes. But the problems that Catholics are having are, well, it's the infiltration of liberalism, right? They're all caving into the sexual culture, to the materialism. But with the Catholics, because we're the vast majority of us are immigrants, it really depends on when your family got to the States and how fast liberalism sort of is infused throughout your ancestral roots, right? I'm first generation. I was born in this country, which means I had direct roots back to the old island, to Sicilian island, which was my parents. That's where they were from. So I spoke the language at home. I understood the culture, and the faith was strong and vibrant in my house. However, if you're an Italian, you got here in the 1880s or 1920s or 1940s, it's a different ballgame. We're now 3 and 4 and 5 generations into this thing. And at some point, you got to accept the liberal values. You have to be able to, again, what's the word I'm looking for now? Assimilate into the American culture. A lot of it for practical reasons, right? We're in America now. It's good to speak American. It's good to take up American values or customs. I get that. But as liberalism kicks in, there's some natural effects of this. And I've said it before. Once you're here, multi-generational, the first thing that goes is the language. Once the language is gone, then goes the culture. Then once the culture is gone, then goes the faith. At that point, are you Italian anymore? That's the question. You may have Italian blood in you, I get that. But do you have any relation back to the old country? It's like a few years back, I was going to the dentist, and the nurse there that was helping out, prepping me for my work that day, her last name was something like Manzini or something, like some Italian name, right? And I'm in Utah. I'm in Mormonville. And when I see an Italian last name, I'm going to introduce myself, see what the story is here, man. I miss talking to Italians, right? I mean, we get some out here, but not a whole lot, let me tell you. And so I'm like, hey, well, are you Italian? What's your story here? He goes, yeah, I'm Italian. I'm from New York, and I moved out here because of my daughter. She got her job or something like that. And I said, okay. I said, do you speak Italian? And she was like, no. I'm like, my great grandfather came here from Italy back in like the 1920s. And so I really don't speak the language. And, we got stories of my grandfather, but I really don't know much. I really don't know much about the culture. I'm just kind of working and doing what I do. And it's interesting because she was a lovely lady. And, she had this Italian last name, but she knew nothing about her Italian ancestral roots. It's like all she had was a last name and some abstract story about a great grandfather that came from Italy 2 or 3 generations ago. The question is, are you still Italian? And that's the question that most Italians have to ask themselves with their offspring. Now, I get it. We all got a mortgage to pay. We can't think 2, 3 generations down the line, but it's really an important question. And I've asked this a lot because I think the liberal society in some ways was a ruse, especially for Italians, because after World War II, after Italy was bombed into oblivion, there was choices that had to be made as the infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Many Italians left because of the failure of this infrastructure. Now, we had Italian immigration even before World War II. But again, you had World War I in the mix, you had the Italian Revolution, and Italy being up in geopolitical turmoil for almost a century really had a lot of Italians fleeing for greener pastures. And these were tough decisions because once you left that time, you were gone. And whatever the consequences were of your ancestral future, what your grandkids or great grandkids, what they would turn into eventually was anything else but being Italian. You're not in Italy anymore. The language is not going to be necessary. The culture is not going to be necessary anymore. And eventually the faith would go with it. And that's what we saw with a lot of Italians. What we saw with a lot of Germans and Irish and Polish. Everybody that comes to America has to adopt the liberal values. And adopting the liberal values means you surrender the language, you surrender the culture, and eventually, as we've seen through the concepts of religious liberty, you surrender the faith. And in many ways, these people they lack a sense of identity. And the question is, right, as seductive as liberalism was, as it put this economic emphasis and the promises of material prosperity in front of Italians that struggled in Sicily and other parts of the world. If those Italian grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents knew that their ancestral lines would be so devoid of Italian culture, but even more so the faith, would they have come? Because in many ways, because we allow for, again, religious liberty, because Catholics can build their churches here and sort of coexist here with the pluralistic sort of, Protestant culture, in some ways, okay, well, we're going to a nation where we can practice our faith. But as we now know, there's more to the Catholic faith than just going to church. It's a broader cultural faith. It's a faith that goes through familiar lines. It's a faith that needs that the greater public sort of honor to God is of essence in the Catholic faith. I think it's in essence to any faith. But what Catholicism is not is a privatized faith like Protestantism. We're not, hey, here's your Bible, go home, go hide out in your basement and read your Bible and you will find salvation. That's not Catholicism. And then when you mix it in, again, in a highly intellectual culture, highly educated culture like America, where now Protestants are here with their influence, and because from the founding principles, it was a Freemasonic Protestant nation, they have every advantage in the world. And this is why when Italians are coming over, they're not just facing discrimination early on, but they're being encouraged to drop their Catholic faith, especially Sicilians, because Sicilians were looked upon as, again, being sort of superstitious because we had this folklore Catholicism, right? This greater exterior sort of, how we celebrated the faith on the outside, right? We're loud. And so we chant, we march, we sing, we have statues, we have the arts, we have the crucifix, we have all the exterior presentations of the faith. And we proclaim it publicly because it's a public faith. And that's why we get these stories of when poor Sicilian immigrants get here and they needed social services help. It was the Protestants that were pressuring them to sort of take care of their babies different than how they were traditionally being handled in Italy or in Sicily. So, for example, one of the things that we heard of, one of the records we have is that Catholics always like to keep their windows closed, right? So a draft doesn't come in to get the baby sick. Protestants will come in there and open the windows up. Those are some of the little minutiae that we got, right? From the early times, from the early Sicilians. And so different customs, different ways, the encouragement to drop their faith, especially when kids started going to school, the encouragement to switch from the Catholic faith to the Protestant faith, right? Because Catholicism was seen as what? Superstitious. It was seen as, again, idol worshipers. It was odd, it was strange, because America was founded on the principles of really the disordered wars of Protestants from its day one, right? That's what America was. It was Protestant in origin, again, mixed in with Freemasonic values. But these are the challenges we face. And from day one, Catholics were encouraged to abandon their faith and to accept these new religious principles of religious freedom, simplify everything, sola scriptura, the Bible, that's all you need anyways. Leave your old world superstitions back in the old world. You're in America now. This is the new world. We're technologically advanced. We use logic and reason here. You're going to live a better life. You're going to speak a better language. And by speaking that better language, you're going to prosper. You don't want to keep the same superstitions of the old world that kept you down, that kept you poor. That was the attitude of the Protestants, right? And so these are some of the challenges we faced early on. Come to find out later on that Protestantism is now splintering like wildfire. I mean, it's crazy, that doctrinal sort of anarchy that begins really in the 19th century and spreads to the 20th century. So on one hand, the Protestants are encouraging Catholics to leave the faith, to leave the church of their ancestors, while there's no doctrinal unity at all within Protestantism. And it is just a flaming pile of contradictions at every turn, right? They could consolidate behind the idea of sola scriptura or just have faith in Jesus. But apart from that, it was one contradiction after another. And so these are the challenges that we faced as immigrants to this country. And as time and space will go on, then you got the elements of the greater liberal culture, right? Freedom, liberty, morality now is determined by politics, is determined by the vote, is determined by representative government. Your morals, again, your morals are not determined by the church anymore, because the church doesn't have any power in America. We have individual autonomy with freedom and liberty. We take our moral principles to the voting booth. We get to vote in America for our moral principles, right? That's what we did here. And so this was a game changer. And as liberalism creeped in, well, what does liberalism actually mean? Liberalism is a form of secularism. And now Italians through ancestral roots, because you don't have that culture in Italy to reinforce. You don't have your family around to reinforce. You don't have a church in place that's strong in the old world, like it was in the old world, where it was the backdrop of the faith anymore. It becomes, again, somewhat privatized in a sense that you better be an outgoing Catholic that really cares about the faith. You better be devout in order to keep your faith, because if you become somewhat lukewarm, you're going to lose the faith here in America, because there is no cultural reinforcement and there is no ties between government and the church like there was in the old world. And that's where Italians and other immigrants started to lose the faith. And this is one generation after the next, starting in the 1880s, all the way through the 1920s, all the way through the 1960s. So in essence, what happens is the further you are away from your ancestral roots that got you to America, the more you would apostatize. As in the case of this lady I met, lovely lady, she's 3 or 4 generations here. She has no knowledge of her Italian past. It is gone. The language, the memories, the stories, the links to family, the faith, the culture, it's been wiped out. She's kind of just, I don't know, what do you call it? Somebody, wandering in the wilderness, because you said, well, maybe she adopted American values. Okay, what are American values? What are they? Freedom, liberty, freedom, liberty. Okay, I guess. Freedom, liberty, it's a good thing in the sense that we're afforded certain freedom and liberties, but we've seen freedom and liberty in America. It's become an act of license at this point, and it's brought about moral degradation. Freedom, liberty, as I keep telling you, is not an answer. It's a state of being, but it's not necessarily a state of virtue. It depends whatever you do with freedom, liberty, right? This is why we've seen the breakdown of culture. And so Italians have become detached from their history, detached from their ancestral roots, and they start having problems, and they start apostatizing. And with that apostasy comes all the same moral dysfunctions that Protestants are having in this country, right? You start seeing the illegitimacy. You start seeing the broken families. You start seeing the great disorders. The question is, when did they get here? How long have they been devoid or absent or have lost that connection to the old world and the old tradition? That's generally what determined it in the past. Now, as far as the current first generation, which is my generation, most of us still speak the language. Most of us still know the culture, but because the rate of the apostasy has increased to record levels now, we're at a point in time now where even those ancestral roots, those connections back, in a lot of cases aren't helping you. Because even in Italy, this apostasy is spread far and wide. There's no Italian culture look back upon that's any different, because they've liberalized since the end of World War II, right? It just depends when your family left Italy, came here, and what circumstances. But in general, because we're in a state of the great apostasy, it's consuming everything around us. Even my generation, the first generation, is starting to succumb. And they were starting to succumb in the 90s too, let's be honest. It's just some of us chose to respect the faith, chose to respect our ancestral roots, chose to respect our Italianness. We chose to keep the language. The question is really going to be our children's generation, my children's generation. I think there'll be problems there, right? And furthermore, when we get into our grandchildren's generation, because the language is not going to be taught. They're not going to learn the language. The culture, there have some elements of it within my children's generation, but the one after that will forget the culture. And then you got Protestantism in the mix. Because what's happening now is, and I've seen it with my generation, They didn't marry other Italians. They married non-Italians, right? And even more so, they married non-Catholics. I think if Italians marry non-Italians, it can be remedied if they're Catholic partners, devout Catholic partners. But if now you're marrying Protestants or Jews or even nominal Catholics, lukewarm Catholics that are not really practicing the faith, those future lines of ancestry, those, those heirs or, those offspring are going to have a lot of problems. And I'm already seeing that with Catholics that have married Protestants. They're raising kids in Protestant churches. And what's going to happen, and these predictions always come true, those kids, if not those kids, it'll be those kids' kids, will all completely apostatize and won't believe in anything. Because that's the natural digression of faith. You go from Catholic to Protestant to believing in nothing. That's what history has always shown. Protestantism always leads to effectively to the abandonment of God at some point, because again, it's not real. It's a disordered relationship with God. And these are the challenges that many Italians, many Americans are going to face. And a lot of us are not taught to think that way, right? Because we're in a pluralistic culture. We preach pluralism all the time, right? We got the hit it and quit it culture. It doesn't matter what color, what race, what creed, none of that matters. As long as you're happy, as long as you feel good, as long as we're engaging in the act of, sexuality, because that's what we pursue now. In fact, that's the standard by which we're picking partners now, as backward as that is, right? And so the hookup culture, the liberal culture, combined with the moral breakdown, has led to us making terrible decisions on how we form relationships, starting with marriages. That's why so many marriages end in divorce now, is because the way we form relationships, the way that is, it's broken, right? We're going to clubs, we're going to bars, we're not meeting people, we're not courting properly, where families have a say-so, where families may have an influence when couples are getting together. We have the disordered issue now that's affecting everybody at this point in history. Nobody knows how to deal with that, right? I mean, okay, I'm not gonna get into it. I'm not gonna get into it. But again, what this lady proved to me, or at least what I saw, I'll say that as what I saw, was the fact that through the immigration process, there are certain steps of how Catholics lose the faith in America. And I don't know there's anything that can be done about it. Right? I just think if you come to America, you come to America, you have to adapt. And that's fine. The problem is, what are you adapting into? That's the question. Because I ask my classical liberal friends all the time, what's American culture? 4th of July, some firecrackers, the NFL, apple pie. What is American culture? Nobody can really answer that question other than, let's get back to the founding principles. And as we highlighted on this show, there's a problem with the founding principles. Right? I mean, these were Masons, these were Protestants. They were unorthodox in their faith. I don't know what there is to follow from the founding, to be honest with you, other than a few negative rights that I may or may not agree with. These are deep, systematic cultural problems. And the problem, the reason why you don't have any culture in America, I'm going to be flat out honest with you, is because there's no true religion in America. Italian culture is based on the Catholic Church. That it governed that civilization for 1,600 years. It gave us the stories. It gave us the folklore events, how we're to govern, how we're to practice the faith, the stories of the saints, the stories of the martyrs, the stories of the doctors' church, the stories of the prelates, the stories of, again, the laity that made great sacrifices. But in America, what stories do we have? What stories do we have? Oh, guess what? You got Protestant A over here and Protestant B over here. I disagree. I'm going to go my way, start my church, and I'm going to go my way, start my other church. How do you start a culture without common values? You can't, and you can't have common values if you don't have a common religion and common faith. That's why the hierarchical structure, not only of the church, but civilization is so important. That's why you got Mormons running for Utah in the 1830s to get away from basically the long arm of the law so they could do what they need to do by themselves and isolate themselves from the greater world. Some people say, well, that's freedom and liberty. I say that's disorder. You can't separate yourself from the greater world because we're communal creatures. If you're not going to make an effort to coexist with the very same people who you live with within the realm of your borders, you're only going to create a divisive society. Look where we're at today in America. Look where we're at. We're at each other's throats precisely because we have no common values and no common religion. Catholics have fallen for this, And I don't know if there's an answer other than to evangelize. I know that's the answer. And for the longest time, America looked like it was going to become a Catholic nation. And then, of course, Vatican II comes around and everything. I'm not going to get into that. But this is where we're at now. So what does it mean for future generations? Why do you have a bunch of woke liberals running around? It's their freedom and liberty. They're coming from broken, disordered families because there was never no values consolidated that ever protected the family from these outer forces, these outer liberal forces that have destroyed families in America. That's the bottom line. Without true faith, there could be no true culture. And without true culture, the family is destroyed. And once the family is destroyed, there goes your political system. It becomes corrupt to the core. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Listen, I picked on Protestants last night. I'm telling you what's gone wrong with the Catholics in America over the past 100, 150 years. There you have it. I'm fair and balanced. I call it like I see it. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.